So, would you believe it if we told you we had the full list of the very first 6 Half-Bloods who founded Camp Half-Blood? We do, thanks to Camp Half-Blood Confidential. We know exactly how Chiron came to be revered as one of the greatest demigod teachers in history, and who his first class of students were. So let's not waste any time and get straight into it. Back in the olden days in ancient Greece, Chiron was but a young centaur who didn't belong to any particular tribe, which was a bit unusual for centaurs back in the day. Most centaurs had a reputation for being rowdy, party animals with no respect for rules or common decency. But Chiron was already much more civilized than his centaur reputation let on. One fateful day, Apollo came down from the sun chariot and introduced himself to Chiron, later asking for a ride. And even though Chiron isn't fond of giving rides, it was difficult to say no to a god. On the ride, however, they bonded more than either of them had anticipated, and Apollo began to teach Chiron some of his useful skills that a hero may need, which means that we actually have Apollo to thank for the very dawn of Camp Half-Blood initiates. After a year of learning archery, craftsmanship, music, and other skills that fell under Apollo's jurisdiction, like medicine and poetry, Apollo brought forth 6 young demigods that he encountered for Chiron to train. At this point, Camp Half-Blood was little more than Chiron's cave in the foothills of Greece, with a nearby valley to train combat. There were no cabins, no big house, no dining pavilion, and only 6 heroes. But all 6 of these demigods would eventually grow into some of the most well-revered heroes of our time. The first of which was Achilles, arguably one of the most famous demigods of all time. As the son of King Peleus and the nymph Thetis, Achilles was already unique to the rest of the demigods since he could not be harmed. He was dipped in the Styx as a mere infant, and so he was already invulnerable to any sort of harm, but he still needed to learn proper swordsmanship and skills to carry into war with him. Being invincible wasn't worth much if he didn't have any offensive output to cut down his enemies, and so it was under Chiron's tutelage that Achilles became one of the premier swordsmen in all of Greece. What's so tragic about his story, however, is that the second of the 6 was Aeneas, son of the Trojan prince Anchises and the goddess Aphrodite. Chiron remarks that he bore no resemblance to the goddess of love, who is usually shown to be a pacifist who doesn't get into physical fights often. Aeneas, however, was a gifted hand-to-hand fighter and was a swordsman on par with Achilles, only with the inherent disadvantage that he could be wounded and killed and Achilles could not. The two trained together in the foothills of Mount Pelion for years until the fateful day came when the Trojan War broke out. As the son of the Trojan prince, Aeneas was drafted to fight with Troy, whereas Achilles was tasked with invading and conquering the very same city that Aeneas was fighting to defend. In his younger years, Achilles was cautioned by Chiron to wear something sturdier on his right foot, like a plate over the back of his heel. But Achilles continually refused until eventually a rogue arrow pierced his ankle during the Trojan War, leading to his death. Aeneas, however, survived, and by all accounts became a ferocious leader for all the remaining Trojans, who had just lost the war, had their city sacked, and were currently on the run. The Percy Jackson universe doesn't officially confirm what happened to Aeneas after the fall of Troy, but most real-world sources believe that he rose through the ranks and led the renegade Trojans west, and a lot of Roman myths later down the line point to this tribe as being influential in the foundation and growth of the Roman Empire. Where Romulus and Remus were actually founders of Rome itself, Aeneas and his men symbolized the enemies of the Greeks, and in order to separate themselves from Greek cultural significance, the Romans began to construct stories of their lineage being tied back to this rogue band of survivors. This is all a much deeper dive into history and real-world mythology texts than we're going to get into right now, but whether or not this is true in the universe of Percy Jackson, we do know that Aeneas was revered by the Romans and became a staple of Roman tradition and storytelling. Next up, we also know that this first class also taught Jason, the famed captain of the Argo and the one who claimed the Golden Fleece. He eventually gathered an entire team of demigods of his own, sailing the world aboard one of the mightiest seafaring vessels that the ancient world had ever seen. What's interesting about Jason is that he wasn't a direct demigod, but rather he was a legacy of Hermes and Prometheus. His parents were Aeson of Iolcus and Polymede, and back in his family tree, his father could trace his roots to Prometheus and his mother to Hermes, and he became an excellent seafarer under Chiron's tutelage. Next, we have Atalanta, who immediately showed a remarkable skill for archery, but she was also one of the most savage of the recruits. Chiron remarks that she had a dark streak, and her training was much more violent and ruthless than the other recruits. She was notoriously difficult to work with, but her attitude makes sense when you learn that her father was set on having a son, so he brought her out into the wilderness and left her to die when she was just an infant. Adopted by a bear, she was raised in the wilderness until 2 hunters came across her and brought her back to civilization, but as a child, she learned the savage ways of the wilderness survival. When she got to Camp Half-Blood, this aggression followed her, and she grew into a mighty hunter. The original Perseus, slayer of Medusa and son of Zeus, was also a member of this first graduating class. And rounding out our list is Asclepius, who was Apollo's own son and eventually became a god himself. He was a natural healer, one of the best doctors in Greece, and he died at the hands of Zeus, who believed that Asclepius was such a talented healer that he posed a threat to the eternal division between the gods and mankind. If Asclepius was allowed to continue learning medicine, then mankind may eventually become immortal themselves. But a bereaved Apollo bartered with his father to bring Asclepius back as a god. This way, he could remain alive and keep the gods and humans separate, so Asclepius became the god of medicine and surgery. Together, the 6 of them built the foundations of Camp Half-Blood, both the good and the bad. As the 6 grew and graduated, Chiron began welcoming in more and more campers, and eventually he needed to move the camp from Mount Pelion to the base of Olympus itself, since there was simply not enough room to train everyone who needed him. With the demigods, however, came the grudges that their families had fostered for generations, and this led to infighting and feuding between demigods. Chiron's solution to this was to separate campers by godly parent, so that they would not be forced to live in the same immediate quarters as some of their most notorious rivals. This is what eventually led to the cabin system, but each individual family was tasked with creating a custom cabin to honor their godly parent. So even though Chiron oversaw the construction of the cabins, the campers had free reign to be as creative as they wanted, and that's why each cabin is so unique. It was this very same infighting that eventually led to Argus being brought on as a security consultant to keep the campers in line, but Chiron's hubris got the best of him. He knew that demigods were easy for monsters to detect, and after all, they were all here for a reason. Monsters could sniff out and hunt demigods, and such a large gathering of them was bound to draw attention sooner or later. He tells of the first great siege, a swarm of monsters that overran the camp at the behest of an unknown puppeteer, and the battle that ensued lasted from sundown all the way to the dawn of the next morning. The monsters took the camp, sacked the cabins, slaughtered the campers, and nearly conquered the entirety of the camp. But the saving grace that kept Camp Half-Blood alive was the veterans who had heard of this plight. By this point, Chiron had already seen the graduation of a few generations of demigods, and when they heard of the siege, they immediately took up arms to come and rescue Chiron and the young demigods who needed them. And if it hadn't been for the first few generations, the entire camp would have died out as soon as it had been built. As the sun rose over camp, Chiron tells of a swarm of veteran demigods who he had trained into adulthood, riding into battle to defend their old teacher. We don't officially know if any of the 6 were present for the Great Siege, and to this day, Chiron does not know who conducted the raid that almost leveled his camp, but it shows the first ever tale of endurance for the camp as a whole. In the aftermath, Chiron sent an iris message to the gods and asked them for enhanced security, and the gods agreed. They placed a mystical veil over the camp, a barrier that would protect the hills of Camp Half-Blood from mortals and monsters alike, obscuring the scent and visibility of anyone who was not a demigod themselves, and any monster that approached would be met with a wall of mystical power to keep them at bay. From here, the camp moved across the world with the balance of power, always following closely behind Olympus and the gods as they moved from country to country until about 1860, when the Industrial Revolution hit its stride in the United States. As America became a hub of power and influence, the gods moved here, and the camp followed closely behind them. We do know that the American Civil War was a feud between Greek and Roman demigods, the full details of which are still a mystery, but it's possible that all demigods began to move over here at the same time, fighting for territory and security. Eventually, the Greeks would win, and the Romans seemed like they were pushed out west, but against all odds, Camp Half-Blood continued to prosper in all of its glory. The camp, however, can trace its foundations back to just 6 demigods, 6 talented warriors who owe their lives to the teachings of a young centaur who wanted nothing more than to pass on the lessons he had learned from the great Apollo. His teachings forged some of the most powerful demigods in history in the fire of combat, and without these 6 and their teacher, the world as we know it would be vastly, vastly different. But that's the story of Chiron's first class, and the 6 demigods who founded Camp Half-Blood. What do you think of our tale? And what else would you like us to see us cover going forward? We absolutely love this series, we love talking about the series, and we would like you to join in the conversation as well. Take care, my friends, and we'll see you in the next one.